Welcome to our latest PETA webinar. My name is Cassie. I am delighted to be your host for this session. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and just pay my respects to elders past and present. It is really humbling to talk about the power of stories on the lands of the oldest living culture on Earth. It's a culture with such a rich storytelling tradition, and we are just so lucky to be able to have a conversation on a land that's so ready for conversations. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you all for joining us. This webinar is being recorded, so we have asked you to keep your microphones and cameras off, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. So please don't hesitate. Please drop any questions, any comments you might have into the chat. I am keeping an eye on that. I will make sure that you are heard, and we definitely want to hear your voice. We love to have conversations with you. You guys absolutely make these webinars better every time, so please feel free to join in. Now, let's just get immediately to the good stuff, shall we? I am so thrilled to introduce our guest, Radhiah Chowdhury. Radhiah has edited books for children at Scholastic Australia, at Allen and Unwin. She is currently a commissioning editor and audio producer for children and adults at Penguin Random House Australia. She's also a writer, and her latest book is absolutely fantastic. It's called The Katha Chest. We have been passing this book around the PETA office this week to make sure that everyone has read it. We are a little bit in love with it. This is cover, and it is absolutely gorgeous. We also released a little review of it today, so hopefully you've all had a read of that in our newsletter. But let's find out more about it and about Radhiah. So welcome, Radhiah. Thank you for joining us. Tell us about your book. Where did the idea come from?
Thanks, Cassie. I'm so pleased to be here. And just to say, I'm coming to everyone from the unceded lands of the Dharawal Nation in Sydney Southwest. And it always was, always will be Aboriginal land. This particular book came to me actually. It was originally an adult short story that I wrote after my aunt passed away in 2017. And she was the first person in my parents' generation to leave us. And unlike some of the other deaths we'd sort of processed in the family in the past, just because we're a very diasporic family and we're sort of covering all over the world, there was a sense that we hadn't been able to come together to grieve properly and to, more importantly, to remember her life properly. So it kind of got me thinking about what it is to remember women whose stories that may not have been explicitly, you may not have been sat down and told them. And especially this is the case for women of colour and women who come from like non-Western cultures. The idea sort of seems to be that they are very monolithic experiences that these women have, and that's so far from the truth. But and my family is not unique by any way in terms of just how diverse their experiences have been. So yeah, I sort of started writing the short story to exercise all of those feelings. And then, as sort of luck would have it, as privilege would have it, I was working at Allen Unwin at the time, and Erica Wagner was one of the publishers there at the time. She's since retired. And so she and I were just chatting about projects that I had. And I shared this one with her just to say, I'd done it. And she looked at it and thought and said, this really feels like it could be a children's book with some judicious edits. And of course, I was so thrilled at the idea of that, because for me, this book was always something that was designed to preserve family history for my nieces particularly, who are all growing up in, not in Bangladesh, and who are growing up in often multilingual families, and they're kind of losing touch with that old heritage, especially. This is not, I couldn't have foreseen this, but especially in the time of COVID when we can't travel to be with one another, and the prospect of travelling back to Bangladesh for a lot of us is something that's going to be at least a couple of years down the track. So sort of how to memorialise all of that was part of where this book came from.
Can you explain a little bit about both like the plot of the book, how the story unfolds, and also the process of writing something that is so multi-layered?
Sure. So the process of this book, the actual pagination of this book, It was something I was always very adamant about when we first started talking about making it into a picture book, that there should be an interplay between spreads that have text and spreads that don't, because visual storytelling is such a core part of Bangladeshi culture, but also it's an accessibility thing as well, to really allow people to sit and understand a story in their own way without imposing a meaning upon it with your words. And so I didn't really have an idea how exactly that could be done. My background is as a picture book editor myself, so I knew that, the right illustrator would have to be part of this. But how that illustrator would actually get those story notes across without me layering text on top of it was something that was really important to me. And it was also very important, and something that Alan and I were very hospitable to, that the illustrator should be a person of colour. I wasn't insistent that it should be someone from South Asia or Bangladesh specifically, also because I know the limitations that the CBCA sort of put on Australian residencies and citizenship for awards, things, and so I know publishers are very hesitant to work with overseas illustrators for that reason. So I didn't know whether there was someone from a South Asian background I could work with, but I really wanted someone from a migrant background of some form, so that they could bring the layered history of their families, and the women specifically of their families and their heritage and their art, to the artwork that ultimately would be in this book. And sort of as the luck would wonderfully have it, Lavanya is West Bengali, so she and I share quite a bit of heritage. And, she understood completely immediately what the story notes were and what the language was, and sort of how to represent both of those things without text. So basically I gave her some key notes in terms of what each spread should look like what notes to hit, and then she interpreted that and put it into the pattachitra art style that she uses. That's almost like a graphic novel spread of stories across 4 pages. So the way the book sort of goes, it starts off quite traditionally with, text and illustration and present day. But as the main character, Asia, starts going through this treasure chest that's sort of filled with the stories of her aunts, it unfolds literally the stories on the page. And we go from eldest aunt to youngest aunt in her family. So, she pulls out a katha that is made from the sari of her eldest aunt, and then we move into the story of her eldest aunt, and then the middle aunt and third aunt. And I wanted to keep my language in the book as well, because first of all, for me, that was important, as I said, for my nieces who are growing up in multilingual families and often have kind of lost a lot of that Bengali heritage, speaking heritage, which I grew up with. My parents were very adamant that we would speak Bengali at home. But also, particularly for Bengali, it's a language, as a lot of nationalistic movements go, it's a language that's very much tied to our identity as Bangladeshi people, because when we were occupied by Pakistan and the independence movement started in the 60s and 70s, the occupying Pakistani government snapped down on our language and sort of made it illegal to teach, made it illegal to publish in our language. And then the sort of apogee of all of that was that there was a genocide of all the intellectuals and artists in our in the country who were sort of preserving the language. Teachers, artists, writers, journalists. They were sort of rounded up over the course of a few weeks and murdered. And that story is represented in the book, but in the gentlest way possible, obviously, because there are children who are reading it. So Borokalu, who is Kala, so Kala for us. Bengali is this wonderful language, like so many, where our relationships with certain people in our lives have very specific names. So Kala for us means the sister of my mother. Mama means the brother of my mother. Fufu means my dad's sister, and Chachu means my dad's brother. And so, like these, it's so much more than aunt. It means this is a person who belongs to me. So that all of those sort of layers came together when I was thinking about how language should work in this book. And yeah, just to return to Borokalu, the first 4-panel spread of of the Kathas is Borokalu and Kala's story of, a man who had to go into hiding to save himself from this genocide, and sort of the unspoken side of that in my family history, which is that my Kala raised 3 children and was heavily pregnant with her 4th as my uncle had left, and she was managing the household on her own. She was managing raids by the Pakistani army trying to find her husband. She was managing my father, who was living with her at the time, who was a student and just wanted to be a soldier. And, she was trying to save her little brother from rushing off into war and losing his life. So, the struggle of what that life actually was when my Kalu was away is sort of represented in that first spread.
It is. I was still on mute. Apologies, everyone. It's really remarkable how much is contained in these images, particularly these really not necessarily difficult topics, but heavier topics, more weighty and complex ideas of people's lives are all there in the images. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about the book starting for perhaps an older audience and then coming down to be for children, and that it still operates potentially as an entry point to have really complex discussions. It's really interesting how so much of that is contained in the illustrations. And it sounds like you just gave story notes of what you wanted these stories to look like to your illustrator, and she built them from there. Is that how the collaboration worked?
Well, Lavanya, actually, she's a dream in the sense of what an illustrator could be. So I'm actually just going to share my screen so I can show you one of them.
Thank you so much. We did just have a question for an image from the book.
Oh,
We're so glad to bring them directly to you.
There you go. Sorry, I'm a chaotic person who has 100 tabs open, so just give me 1 second to share. There we go. Okay. So this is Shejal Kala's story. And for me, the notes that I gave to Lavanya, she asked for so much detailed family history, to the point where I had to have a conversation with my editor about the fact that some of these stories are wholly analogous to women in my family, but a lot of them are portmanteaus of quite a few people in my family. They all have some relevance, but not all of them are directly linked to people. And so when Lavanya was asking for, can I have this detailed family history, I was like, sure, I can give it to you, but it's not the only thing that will be governing how these stories pan out. So Shejal Kala is a really great example, which is the spread I've given here. And so Shejal Kala is she's a portmanteau of a couple of my aunts who are teachers, but also a couple of my aunts and my cousins who have had sort of loss of children of children in their lives. And so I pulled a lot of them together. And so there is not the one person who this story refers to, but a funny thing that so many of them have in common is they're teachers, and they're all very precise with their clothing. I've never seen any of these women look a mess in any context. So that was the kind of note that I gave to Lavanya, that, this is a person who is, this character should be someone who has a love of education and of reading and of teaching specifically, and also has had this tragedy in her life, but throughout all of it is always very put together. And that's, I'll just go to the previous spread. That's sort of where the text leads you, is that Shejal Kala is always neat and stiff. Like, her clothes are always neat and stiff, and she's never messy, but she's got so much love in her, which is where the text goes first. Like, it says that, she laughs and she holds Asiya, but at the same time, you've got this sort of shift in the fact that her clothes are still quite precise and crisp and starchy. And so when I gave those notes to Lavanya, this is what she came up with. She came up with, we talked a little bit about how women from both of our cultures, we don't always wear saris. We often wear salwar kameez, which is what Shejal Kala is wearing in the first spread. So it's the tunic and pants with dupatta, and so we talked about that, and so she popped that in here. And then when she did have Shejukala wearing a sari, she's always like, the folds are very crisp and precise and neat, and she's, with the color palette, also worked in the fact that this is a woman who has deep tragedy in her life, but there's also great joy. And so you've got the muted color palette, but you've also got these pops of orange and yellow in there that sort of bring out that sense of happiness and youth and joy. So yeah, that's a sort of example of how Lavanya and I sort of chatted together until she got to a point where she thought, yep, I'm going to run with it. And so that third panel specifically, where you see the daughter passing away, we did have a very complicated chat with this spread, and also this last spread, where we're talking about someone who is absent, someone who's passed away, and how do we represent that in an illustration. And it was just a really interesting conversation to have, because Lavanya is from a Hindu background, and she was saying, well, maybe we can do what my family and Hindu families do, which is to have a portrait of the person, the deceased, on a mantle or a wall somewhere, and it's sort of garlanded with flowers. And then we had to have this conversation of like, well, no, my family is Muslim. We absolutely categorically do not do that. So we can't have that in this particular book. So yeah, how do you represent those things? And so with this spread, yeah, so she went with like the spirit of the daughter leaving the body instead.
It's absolutely beautiful, and the level of detail is really astonishing. I feel like it's the kind of book that really benefits from really sitting with and really looking at and reading again and again. And there's a lot of opportunities for jumping off points for discussion, and also for creative responses in the classroom, which is really exciting. I know that it's something that just really can capture an imagination. I mean, and it's stunning. I really wanted to ask you about your work too, as in editing and in the world of children's books. You were talking before about making this book and taking the CBCA awards, for example, into consideration, and all these other factors that come into play in publishing. But I know that you're really passionate, obviously, about representation in children's book publishing. You talk about the way that this book is so built, from wanting to make sure that certain things are preserved and represented and talked about. I'd be really interested, I think we all would, to hear you talk more broadly about the children's book space, and sort of the representation and diversity, either issues or wins or thoughts that you have on that space at the moment.
Sure. This is I will need somebody to drag me back from this particular precipice, because I could literally talk about it till the cows come home. So it's something that came up particularly because, you know, my background is as an editor, and I do still consider myself a publishing professional above being a writer, and it's a particular privilege I'm very aware of, to be able to say that you know, I write when I want to and not because I have to. But it was, you know, it's been very interesting being on this side of the relationship. I did publish another book in 2019 called Jumble, and you know, it's a very important book to me as well, and it came from a similar spirit of, you know, a life event that prompted me to want to speak to it in some way. And so that particular book, which I have here actually, that particular book was written for my goddaughter Audrey, and it was published by Scholastic in 2019. And it's sort of about language and how we communicate. And it was built as a way to sort of start having conversations with these young people in my life about, you know, this part of my personality that I really love sharing with them, which is my love of words and how much of a word nerd I am. So when it came to the Katha Chest, and we were talking about like a publicity angle and what exactly would this book, would this book be pushed out into the market, it was an interesting place to be, because it's quite remarkably different to Jumble in its tone, but it is nevertheless another fragment of my personality that is being brought out into a book. And so I was resistant, and I still am quite resistant to the idea of presenting this as a book that's about Bengali culture and heritage, because it is, but that's not what the heart of this book is about, and it's certainly not what I particularly was aiming for when I was writing it, aside from the fact that I wanted my nieces to be able to see themselves in this book and be able to see women from their families in this book. There is a sense of universality to it that I really want to dig into. So, for example, when the advanced copies came in, I gave it to my best friend, whose husband is a second-generation Estonian migrant. His parents came here as refugees after the First World War. And my friend, she's from Kentucky. She's a white girl from Kentucky and has no diasporic background at all. And, her husband, when he read it, there were tears, and he was thinking about his aunts and his mother and their lives. And similarly, my friend was reading it and thinking about the women in her family and their heritage and how we preserve that feminine energy in our lives when women's stories, generally speaking, generally get sort of pushed to the wayside. So as much as I am happy to showcase culture and heritage from my personal background in this book, I'm really resistant as an author to this book being purely marketed in that way. I understand why a publisher would do that, because in a market as crowded as ours, you kind of need to have a point of difference, and that is kind of the point of difference. But I don't think it's actually that helpful to focus on points of difference when it comes to representative publishing, which is a long way to get around to my point, which is that as a publisher myself, it's something that I'm very aware of, and I really speak to my authors about, whether they're adult or children's authors, that if they have just the one book in them and it's something that trades on their identity and their otherness, and often as a result their trauma, then of course I am more than happy to help them get that book out into the world. But if we're talking about a life as a writer and we're talking about a body of work as a writer, there is a tendency, because our industry is so homogeneously monocultural, that if you go down that path, as so many authors have been pushed to do, that becomes the expectation of all you're capable of doing. And so I can think of a handful of First Nations authors, for example, that this has happened to, that First Nations books can only be about dispossession and trauma and violence. And of course, those are realities in the First Nations lived experience, but that's not all that's happening. There is joy, there is love, there is hope, and there's, for example, I can speak only for the First Nations authors that I'm working with. There's, for example, a great hunger for speculative science fiction, fantasy that come from a First Nations background. And if you think about it for just a minute, of course, it makes total sense. Cassie, you opened this webinar with a mention of the stories of the land that we are currently sitting on. And those stories are so rich in these elements. Of course, it makes perfect sense that First Nations authors might have this real visceral connection to more fantastic storytelling than just the limitations that white publishers and the white industry have put on them. So it's something that I'm very conscious of in terms of how we approach authors of colour, myself included, obviously. That's muddied the waters that I sit sort of across both. But how do we approach authors of colour to tell stories, and whether we push our own assumptions and stereotypes and meanings onto them in a way that isn't helpful to actually having this plurality of experience in the stories that are being told, and the lives that are being lived and the reality of those lives. Because if you keep telling people over and over again that all they come down to, all their contribution to culture is how difficult their life is and how traumatic it is and how different they are, that ends up messing with your head. I will be quite honest. And it's why I'm very resistant to the idea of reductionist identity politics, because you're basically creating the vacuum of rich storytelling that you then accuse communities of colour of actually having, which is, it's fundamentally untrue. These are very rich, nuanced cultures with very long-standing heritages of storytelling that may not be traditionally recognisable from a Western canon perspective. But, there are traditions of oral storytelling and mythology and fable that go back literally millennia, and that we should be preserving in the spirit of the cultures that they belong to, as opposed to the white audience that we assume will be reading those stories. So that's sort of the big picture conversation that I am very keen on having as often as possible when it comes to representative publishing. Now, when it comes to the children's space, it is something that is a personal bugbear of mine, that so much of our local market gets taken up by celebrity publishing. And I do want to make a clear delineation between authors who might have celebrity in other spheres, but who are, genuinely interested in writing a book or a series of books and having a life as a writer. And like Alan Brough, for example, is a perfect example of that. But the vast majority of picture books, especially that are coming through from these celebrity authors, they are so reductionist. They appeal to such a lowest common denominator, and I think they do such a grave disservice to what children are capable of imaginatively. And unfortunately, those are the books that take up the lion's share of the market. And if you go to Big W, those are the books that most often will be sitting across all the shelves. And, I mentioned Big W and Kmart and other discount department chains specifically because if we're talking about the accessibility of literature, that's the most accessible point for most families in Australia. As much as we would love to support, and we do support indies and book chains and booksellers specifically, the average mum or dad at Big W who's done their weekly shop and has $10 left in their budget and has to make that decision about whether they spend it on, a new, a new loofah, something about their own personal care, or they spend it on something for the kids. Big W and Kmart and these other discount department stores are sort of the interface of where that decision making is happening. And the fact that those shelves are so overcrowded with these books that are really, really, I think, deteriorating the picture book landscape that we currently inhabit, that is something that is of real great concern to me. And when it's not a comedian writing about farts, it'll be a junior fiction author or a established author of some form who is still who was a great author, don't get me wrong, but take up a great a percentage of a very narrow market. So it makes it very difficult to break out authors that are telling different stories in different ways. And yeah, it's a source of concern for me that I feel like we are shortchanging the next generation of readers because we're not encouraging them to think expansively about what the world is and what it could be.
I think this leads in really nicely. Thank you so much for talking so broadly and thoughtfully and really wisely about the publishing space, because I think all of that is really relevant to our lovely teacher audience that we have with us today, because quite often in the school libraries, the classrooms where books are picked up and discussed and given time for our children is a really important space to make sure that the books that we are using are ones that do not sell children short, do not paint a monocultural picture of the world that we live in. And I was wondering if you had specific advice to maybe brand new teachers who are setting up the books in their classroom for the first time, or teachers who are looking at the books in their classroom and thinking, maybe I need to change what we have here. Does it come down to what you were saying earlier about not looking for stories that are just about trauma and dispossession, and looking for stories that contain, joy and a wide variety of genres and perspectives? Are there things that you would encourage teachers to keep an eye out for when they are building up their libraries in the classroom?
Definitely, I think that is at the heart of it, and it's something that I'm very conscious of as a writer and as a publisher. That I'm not particularly drawn to stories that that are that they seem very obviously packaged to sort of capture a particular culture. As much as those books are really valuable and lovely, I think they are quite limiting because they don't have that sense of expansive universality that a book such as the Katha Chest when I was writing and I really wanted to achieve. So I think certainly look into, like, do the, I guess for lack of a better word, diversity count of your shelves, and to really think about what kind of life or / lives are being represented on the shelves in your classrooms. And also take a very clear look at which authors are represented as well, because there is, it is currently, it's very lucrative at the moment to be telling non-traditional stories, but at the same time, a lot of the authors are still quite universally cisgendered, heteronormative and white. And I think the idea of authenticity in storytelling is very valuable to children. Certainly when it comes to inviting authors to come and speak to children as well. Seeing someone who doesn't, this is going to sound like a horrendous read, and it really genuinely isn't because she's a lovely person, but people who don't all look like Jacqueline Harvey, for example. I think that's really important for kids to be able to see a wide variety of people who are writing, because that's what leads those children to grow up to write. So, there's this amazing privilege that we have, and this access and responsibility that goes with it, that we are building the next generation of writers. And the way to do that is to show them that it's possible, that it's the pathway, in ways that are not necessarily following the traditional mythologies, I think, of authorship, which, tend to be that sort of starving artist in the garret. If you think it, you can be it. The J.K. Rowling of it all, of, I was a starving single mother and I got on a train and I wrote a book. Like, I think it's very worth, especially with older students, really unpacking whether those mythologies have any real meaning, particularly to people from minority backgrounds of any kind, whether it's class backgrounds or different racial backgrounds, because the reality is that those myths are just that, they're mythologies, they're not real. Like, J.K. Rowling quit her job at Amnesty International to get a Scottish Arts Council grant to not work for a year to write Harry Potter. And so, like, that level of honesty, I think, about how books come about is very valuable to kids. And particularly for teachers of classrooms that have particularly non-white students, it's worth noticing or just acknowledging that I remember growing up as a child not having many books, if any, that I could see myself in. And so I became very adept at reading myself into the characters on the page. And I think you'll find, if you really speak to any of your students who are not from white backgrounds, that they are doing the same. And that takes a toll in terms of how you see yourself and your personhood. And so to acknowledge it, and to then also offer books, I'm going to shamelessly plug the Katha Chest, but there's plenty of others, to be showing books that do show a different kind of main character, a different story that is centralized. So the Katha Chest, for me, it was important that there was never going to be anyone who was white in this book, and also that there would be very few men and none of them would ever be centered. It was very, those two core factors to the illustrations were very important to me. So books like that sort of change that norm a little bit, and help the children in your classrooms understand that they shouldn't have to force themselves into narratives that were not built for them, because there are narratives that are hospitable to them. And also, if they can't see those narratives, they should absolutely think about creating them themselves.
Thank you so much. This is such a thoughtful and useful answer. I feel like you have painted a really clear way forward for teachers who are maybe not quite sure of what to do. So thank you so much for the incredible thoughtfulness that you are sharing with all of us. I know that I really appreciate it, and I'm sure that everybody else does too. I have a question here from Maureen, who commented when you were talking about particularly the children's books market, and about how we might, how teachers, I suppose, might be able to talk to parents about the books that they are buying for their children, and if you had any thoughts on how we could perhaps bridge that gap a bit more from this standpoint.
I think I mean, I have ideas, but not being a parent myself, and also, you know, I'm very conscious that I live and operate in a silo of other people who think about books as much as I do. And so with those, we've never had to have those conversations with, you know, all my different, you know, eclectic groups of friends who have children, and my family who do as well. It's never really a conversation we've had to have because it's sort of a given that they are thinking about books this deeply. But I would say, as a suggestion for parents who, you know, I think often the parents are very happy to see their children reading any book. And so if they, you know, let's be honest, books about farts and bums and poos, you know, they do strike a certain chord in children. But I think particularly encouraging the parents who have the wherewithal to actually engage in the books themselves and go for shared reading, as opposed to just, here is a picture book that my child really enjoys just reading on their own. Because at least then you will get a sense as a parent of what the messaging of different books actually is. You get that really fundamental idea of what your child is actually accessing, but also to have that be a conversation, so that you might have a certain interpretation of a book and think that it may not be very good or valuable, but your child might have a completely different perspective on things that might be very valuable to them. So yeah, encouraging a very open dialogue and like really consciously encouraging parents to think about it very much as a conversation. It's never this one-way street of parent picks up book from shelf, gives it to child, end of story. Because that the fundamental skill, the muscle that we're trying to develop in children and adults with good literature is that muscle of collective empathy, of radical empathy. So being able to look at a variegated group of lives that may have nothing to do with you, and to understand that that is the reality that people live, and that everyone is going through something, and that kindness should be at the heart of everything we do. So that radical empathy can only be developed by being as widely read, widely culturally exposed as possible. It's not just reading, obviously. Film and television and music, they all have something to do with it. And it's something that, you know, it's why representative publishing is very important to me, because we are culture makers as well as reactors to culture. And teachers are often very much at the forefront of that, because if parents, you know, obviously parents have a lot on their plates, and if they are not capable for time or resources to be able to have these sorts of deep engagements with their children and what their kids are reading, that's this really incredible position of responsibility and privilege that teachers have instead. And so, yeah, I think it's very much to keep an eye on not just what they're reading, but how kids are reading as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that is really useful information to have, and also a really interesting way to but a really valuable way to frame how we think about having conversations with parents that we are coming into contact with, and people that we know that have children who are reading books to them, how we read books to children. So no, thank you. The way that you speak about the role of books in our society, I think, is one that all of us can really agree on and agree with. I know that it's something that's really important to all of us. So thank you so much for sharing that. We do only have a couple of minutes left, so I did just want to do a quick call out for questions from our lovely attendees, just because I don't want to go over time today, because we do have another engagement for Radhiah to get to. So if you do have a question, just maybe shoot a quick little message in the chat that says, I have a question, and then you can type the longer question if you need to. If not, that is totally fine, because I do have one final question, which is, If you had one piece of advice that you wanted to give, or one piece of writing advice to give to a student that a teacher could say, I went on this author talk with an author and I learned this and I wanted to share it with you, what would you want that to be?
I think it's very, very valuable to talk to students about what storytelling actually means, because it could be written, it could be oral, it could be performative. Everyone has a story that is worth telling. And I think to think prohibitively about what is actually possible as a writer, to have a published book. I say this, I understand with a great deal of irony as someone with a published book, but to really unpack what it means to tell a story, I think is very, very valuable, and also improves accessibility for kids who may have learning disabilities, for example, or just a general lack of access to a vast range of books, for example. So, the idea of storytelling isn't just that you write words on a page or you write a story and then you give it to an editor and you get published. Obviously, that's a very nice thing to happen if it does. But storytelling is so much richer than just the limitations of what you can put on a page and what people are prepared to publish. And so I think, again, I use this word so often, but that sense of expansiveness about how we write and how we tell stories and how we share stories, more importantly. I think that's something really worth unpacking with kids and letting them sort of find their path, because I think that's where we lose a lot of readers, is because they think that that's the only way you can enjoy storytelling. It's the only way you can appreciate it. Whereas, someone who's really, really invested in video games, for example, might be able to tell you what complex narratives go into the average Assassin's Creed game, for example. So, yeah, to really think laterally, that when you have stories to tell, and obviously writing is a very important skill and communication is a very important skill, but when you have a story to tell, think about how best to tell it and how best people might want to hear it. And so, if you're thinking about that audience so broadly and you're thinking about how to disseminate your stories so broadly, hopefully that sort of opens you up more to the fact that other people have stories to tell as well that may not be reaching you in traditional formats.
Thank you so much for every answer to every one of your questions. They have been so valuable. And thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We are so lucky to be able to talk to you and to talk about and see images from this absolutely gorgeous book. I will send around a link, of course, to more information about the book to all of you, and we'll make sure that you get the recording ASAP. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for your time, Radhiah. This has been a wonderful webinar. I am so excited for everyone to share the recording with their other member colleagues, and for us to all have really exciting conversations about books and reading and what it means to share stories. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been very lovely speaking with you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. You have a lovely afternoon, and we'll send you more information about the next webinar in our series. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.